Welcome to Cyberoam Online CCNSP Training Module 4. In this module, we'll be learning about user authentication. So this will be the agenda of our presentation. We'll learn about different types of authentication, different levels of authentication. We'll also learn about different authentication methods provided by Cyberoam, and we'll also have a look at the various identity-based policies. So Cyberoam's layer 8 identifies all traffic by username in place of IP address or MAC addresses. So it becomes very essential for an user to authenticate through the firewall. Now Cyberoam functions using AAA principle. So it not only authenticates but also authorizes and keeps the count of user activity. So in order to authenticate to Cyberoam, there are two types of users and hence two types of flows. The first one is a local authentication, wherein you create the users and the groups on the database of Cyberoam itself, and the other one is the external authentication, wherein you integrate Cyberoam with any external authentication server. It can be Active Directory, LDAP, Radius, or any other external authentication server. So let's have a look at the different types of authentication. So this is what happens, or how the flow happens when you are trying to authenticate locally to Cyberoam. So the user tries to browse any website and it sends the authentication or authorization request, and Cyberoam sends the authentication or authorization result, and finally it authenticates the user if the credentials are good, or else it gives a failed login to the user. In case of external authentication, when Cyberoam is integrated with any Active Directory server or any other external server, the user sends the authentication and authorization request to the Cyberoam, and the Cyberoam forwards the same to the external server, and then the Cyberoam sends the authentication server sends the user authentication result, and finally Cyberoam sends the authentication response to the user and successfully authenticates the user and applies security policies on the user. In case of a failed login, Cyberoam immediately informs the user of a failed login attempt. Now Cyberoam can be integrated to authenticate with any external authentication servers like Active Directory, any kind of LDAP or LDAP-S server like OpenLDAP, Novelty Directory, Apple Directory, or any standard LDAP directory. Or it can also integrate with any Radius server as well. And there is also a third-party integration with Cyberoam's API, wherein let's say you're integrating Cyberoam with any other third-party access point and the users log into the access point with a custom captive portal or a login page, and then that particular authentication server sends a username and password, and that particular device can call the Cyberoam's authentication API, and Cyberoam can automatically authenticate them and apply the security policies on them. So there is no need of double authentication in this case. Cyberoam doesn't ask you for logging in again, but just logs you in depending on what kind of API you are using with Cyberoam. And SSL and Start TLS are also supported for Active Directory and LDAP. Now, local and external authentication servers can be configured at the same time. In case if your external authentication server is down, it can always fail back to the local authentication of Cyberoam. And multiple types of external authentication servers also can be configured at the same time. So this is how you add an external server in Cyberoam. So you go ahead and click on the add option in the identity, and this is how you add the Active Directory or LDAP server. So in the screenshot, you have added an Active Directory server. So you have selected the server type as Active Directory. You can give it any name. Put in the IP address of your Active Directory server on which port it is working. You can also put in the NetBIOS domain name and the username and password. You can leave the connection security to simple, or you can also use SSL as well, depending on what kind of integration or security you're having with your Active Directory or LDAP server. Now there are two types of integration. One is loose integration and the other one is tight integration. We'll be talking about these two types of integration in later slides. And then you've got a display name attribute and you've got your email address attribute. This email address attribute is very essential for when you import the users, that email is automatically imported on the user's properties, and that email is used to send emails by Cyberoam for the quarantine emails and the spam digest settings as well. You have to put in the domain name over here, and you have to add in the query like this equal to training and this equal to local. In this case, the domain name is training.local. And you've got a test connection here. Now you can click on test connection and to see whether the Cyberoam and the Active Directory is connected properly or not. So what this test connection does, it sends a ping and sees whether the server is alive or not. It checks the name of the server as well. So that's pretty much it. Once the connection is successful, you can click on OK, and then you can proceed to the next step of importing different Active Directory groups, or if you're having LDAP, you can create those groups and use those groups from the LDAP server. Now this is how you get the login page. So when you try to log in, when you try to browse any website and you are enforced authentication, you get a login page where you can put in the username and the password. This username and password is now of your Active Directory username and password. And alternately, you can also click here to check your account details, how much data you have used, how much data you have downloaded and uploaded. If you want to change your password, you can even do that. You can also check your quarantine emails. Now, upon first successful login of any user, a user will be created in the Cyberoam's local database. So you have to be very careful. The users, you don't have to import all the users. The users will be automatically created at the Cyberoam once they log in successfully for the first time. Now, if loose integration is selected while adding an Active Directory server, user falls into default open group. Now this is the default group of Cyberoam, which Cyberoam offers you, which is open group. So if you are using a loose integration with Cyberoam and Active Directory, and let's say you've got a sales group in Active Directory and you've got John is a part of sales group in Active Directory and John logs in, but then John will be part of the open group in Cyberoam. But if you are using tight integration, then John will be a member of sales group in Cyberoam as well. So tight integration is selected. While adding the Active Directory server, the user falls into their respective group on Cyberoam if the groups are already created or imported from Active Directory. So that's the main difference between loose and tight integration. If you want the exact user to group mapping on your authentication server, which can be Active Directory or LDAP, better go with tight integration. Or else you can also use loose integration, but then in that case all the users will be a part of the open group. So the next step is after you integrated Cyberoam with Active Directory or LDAP, you have to import the groups from Active Directory. Now you can use the import wizard group, and then in this method Cyberoam will automatically create groups by syncing with the Active Directory server. So once the Active Directory is added, and then you've got the small icon over here which is for the import wizard, you click on that import group wizard and you will be getting that option to import groups like this. So you click on start and then you proceed on the next steps and select which groups you'd like to import from the Active Directory. So you get it like this. You have to put in the base DN. So here in this case it's DC equal to Cyberoam and DC equal to local, and you go to next and then you get the entire 80 groups. So I'm going to import the users and the built-in as well. Here, after this screen, you'll be getting the option to select the security policies, which we advise not to do it over here because you've got much better, because different groups will have different policies. So better don't select the security policies in the group wizard. Rather, come back after you import the groups and then go to individual groups and select appropriate policies for those different groups. So this is what I was talking about, the different security policies. So you can just leave it to the defaults, attach it to all groups, or uncheck all of that and just move forward. And finally you get a snapshot of what exactly you have selected and what are the groups that you're going to import with the base DN, and then you click on next and you click on finish. So let's have a look at the different levels of authentication. So authentication is done at 3 levels at Cyberoam: at the firewall level, at the VPN level, and at the admin level as well. Now the firewall level, you can see in this particular screenshot you've added multiple authentication server. One is local, Active Directory, Radius, LDAP, and Apple Directory. Now this series of external authentication servers can act as a failover as well. Let's say somehow your Active Directory has gone down. Automatically it'll go to the Radius server and check, okay, is that user present in the Radius server as well? Or is that particular user in the LDAP server as well? So it can also act as a failover kind of server in case one of your servers goes down. So first it will check the local database, then it goes to the Active Directory to check the user, then it goes to the Radius. If it doesn't find it, goes to the LDAP and hence forward. In case one of the server is down, automatically it goes to the next one to search for the same user. Now only secure two-factor authentication is the most preferred method at this level since we're talking about VPN. So you can have an Active Directory or a local authentication, but you can punch it up with a two-factor Radius authentication as well. So you can have a Radius server authentication and then you can have your token authentication as well, which is the secure two-factor authentication. Now the admin authentication level, Active Directory or secure two-factor authentication are the most preferred method at this level. So you can either have an Active Directory or a secure two-factor authentication in the admin authentication. Now once you do that and you remove the local, you click on the cross icon, the local comes down over here. So it's only Active Directory. In case if you want to only allow the Active Directory administrators to log into the Cyberoam, you can do that as well. But be a bit careful in case if you lose your connectivity between Active Directory and Cyberoam, your administrator will not be able to log in. However, we have given you a default username admin and password as admin. You can use that username to log into Cyberoam. But it's always advisable to change the default password of admin to something complex. So that's on a side note. In case if you run into this problem, yes, you can go ahead and use the username admin to log into Cyberoam. Now let's have a look at the different authentication methods. So Cyberoam can authenticate a user with 4 methods: client-based, clientless, single sign-on, and SMS or text-based authentication for guest users. The first type of client-based authentication is captive portal, which is nothing but a login page. So when you start to browse, immediately you get a login page which prompts with a web page to input your user credentials, which you can customize it with your company logo with different colors. And you can also secure it using HTTPS rather than going with the default HTTP captive portal. And most importantly, you've got a highly responsive GUI. Now, login page looks different in different mobile devices, different laptops as well. So you have to have a responsive GUI. So if you're logging in from a laptop, you get the same in a responsive manner. If you're getting the same captive portal in an iPhone, on an Android, you get a very responsive GUI in those mobile devices as well. So let's have a look in the computer browser how exactly it looks like. So this is how the captive portal looks like in a computer browser. You can click here for your My Account. You can click here to get a username to access the internet for guest user authentication. And this is how the captive portal looks in an iOS device. So it's highly responsive. And let's have a look at the Android device. So this is how it looks in an Android mobile device. It can be an Android tab, it can be an Android mobile. So this is how it looks in different mobile devices and computers and laptops. Now there are certain captive portal settings which you need to be careful about. So unauthenticated users redirection. What do you like to do if your users are not authenticated? So do you want to redirect them to the login page, or you don't want that, so that they get the access denied page? If you select this no option, they'll be getting an access denied page. Now the unauthenticated user settings, you can either throw them a captive portal or display a custom message as well. You can also enable this HTTPS redirection for captive portal so that the users are automatically getting the captive portal on HTTPS instead of HTTP. This My Account link is what I was showing you in the earlier slide for the login page, wherein you click and get your account details, so you can keep it enabled. URL redirection after login. Yeah, you can enable it. You will see while you do the lab, and when you try to browse some website, let's say google.com, I get the login page. I log in, but I don't get redirected to google.com. So it will only be redirected if you enable this particular setting, and after that you've got another setting which is URL to redirect. Either you can set it to user requested URL. So in my case I requested google.com, so I'll be redirected to google.com, or else you can also redirect it to a custom URL wherein you can redirect it to a company URL or anything. Now, do you want to preserve captive portal after login? So yes, if you set it to yes, then the captive portal will be preserved, but you will be redirected to your own user requested URL or a custom URL depending on your settings. And then do you want the pop-up, that particular login page can be shifted as a pop-up as well. So you've got a setting for that as well. And then you've got the keep alive request for captive portal. If you enable it, Cyberoam will try sending keep alive packet to the live user 3 times at an interval of 3 minutes. And if it doesn't get a reply, it'll log off the user. If you disable that, you can enable the inactivity timeout for user. So you can set a predefined number of minutes. So after that, the user will be kicked off. If you don't transfer this amount of data within that specified number of minutes, the user will be automatically logged off from the Cyberoam database. Now, this is the second way of logging in via the client, which is using client software, and it's called the corporate client or the Cyberoam general authentication client, which you can download from Cyberoam website, and you can use that to log in instead of getting a login page. Now, corporate client is the only authentication method that will work when user or MAC binding is enabled. Now it works for IPv4 only. Now there are some settings in the user properties wherein you can bind a user to a particular MAC address, which means, let's say I'll say that user John, and I'll bind it to a particular laptop MAC address. So the user John will not be able to log in from any other laptop apart from that laptop which has got that MAC address. And this corporate client can be downloaded from www.cyberoam.com/cyberoamclients.html. So you can always go to Cyberoam website, and if you want to download this corporate client, you can download it from there. Now, we've also given you client software for mobile devices. So the first screenshot which you are seeing now is for Android devices. It's a general authentication client for Android, and it's used to authenticate mobile users, and it's available on Play Store. The second one is for iOS, which we call the iAccess client. So iAccess client is for iOS devices, and it's used to authenticate mobile users, and it's available on App Store. So you can see, you can check your account status, you can check your quarantine emails as well from the same iAccess client. Now once you are logged in successfully, a username appears on the live users list. So if you want to check it, you can go to identity and then go to live users, and there you can see which user is logged in via which client from which host IP address. So you can see the IPv4 addresses, and they have logged, some of them have logged in from corporate client, some of them from Android, some of them have used web client, and there are some IPv6 users as well. They've logged in from web client. So depending on the IP family, you can sometimes see the MAC addresses as well. Now remember, only the users who use corporate client see the MAC addresses. So see, this user has used corporate client, and that's why you can see the MAC addresses. Whereas in case of web client, you can't see the MAC address. So you have to use corporate client if you want to receive the MAC addresses at Cyberoam. And if you're planning to use user MAC binding, the user has to use corporate client. Now let's do the lab. So it's lab 12, which is for enforcing authentication. So let's see how we can enforce authentication at Cyberoam. So the first lab is lab 12, wherein we'll be doing enforcing the authentication via the firewall rule, where we'll be making some changes on the firewall rule, and we'll also be creating a rule for DNS in case the users are using ISP DNS. And the next lab is lab 13, wherein we'll be authenticating a user through the captive portal and Cyberoam corporate client, and also change the default captive portal settings as well. So let me RDP into the lab infrastructure. So how do I enforce authentication? So if I go to firewall and if I go to rule, I can see here, say I've already got a DNS rule created at the top in my earlier lab. Now this rule is very important in case if your users are using ISP DNS. Now the rule ID 1 says any host, any destination accepted without any authentication. So you don't have to be authenticated. If you're going via this rule, you can access internet without authentication. So if I try to browse google.com now, say I can browse it. So I can browse without authentication now. However, the rule ID 2 says you have to be an authenticated user, which means any live user, and you have to authenticate yourself. So how do I enforce authentication? Well, what we will do is we will drop the last rule, or rule ID 1, and we'll click on OK. Now in Cyberoam, as I told you earlier, the rule processing is from top to bottom. So first the DNS is resolved when I try to browse. Then it comes down to the next rule and says, okay, I have to authenticate myself. And the last rule is dropped. So I've got no option rather than authenticating myself. So let me see and browse something and see what happens. And see, I get a captive portal. So this is the first lab which you have done, wherein I've enforced authentication. Now the next lab, or lab 14, says that I have to authenticate via captive portal and corporate client. So this is the captive portal wherein I have to authenticate myself. I've got a local user John created on my Cyberoam, so I'll enter the username and password. So now I've successfully logged in. So let me see whether I can browse google.com or not. And sure enough, we can browse it now. So after I authenticated myself, I can browse it. So now the website is open. Now that was the authentication via captive portal. There is another way wherein you can authenticate yourself, which is via the Cyberoam corporate client. So how do I download that? So let me go to cyberoam.com, and now I'll go to support, and I'll go to download Cyberoam clients. And here I've got the Cyberoam's general authentication client for Windows, Linux, Mac, Android, iOS, whichever platform you're using. You can download the software and install it. So now I'll download the installer for Windows since I'm using a Windows machine. So as you can see, we have downloaded it and I'm going to install it now. So I'll click on run. I'll select the language and I'll follow the normal procedure to install it. I don't want to create a quick launch icon. I'll just create a desktop icon and that's it. So I'll migrate to my desktop now, and here I've got, now as you can see, I'll have to put in the server address. Now what is the server address? It's the LAN IP address of Cyberoam since my machine is located on LAN. Now here are some options like auto login. If you want the client to be automatically logged in, you can select this option for auto login. I'm not doing that. So here it'll be saying, asking me for username and password. So I'll write it John and I'll put in the password. I'll click on login and it says you have successfully logged in. Now if you use this client, you will not be getting the login page or captive portal anymore. So you can use it, or depending on what kind of requirements you have, you can go ahead and use that. So since I am now using captive portal, I'm just exiting from the client. I'm just logging off. Alright, and the last lab said customization of captive portal. So how do I customize captive portal? A lot of the users will say, no, I don't want a default logo. I don't want to reveal the product line. I probably want to have a change in color and change of logo. So how do you do all of that from Cyberoam? So all you need to do is go to System, and then you go to Configuration, and then you go to Captive Portal. Now here you can choose your company logo. You can use the default, or you can choose select custom and click on choose file and choose it. You can put in a URL. If you want to have your company URL, you can put in that. You can change the colors if you want. So let's do it like that, and let's have a preview. Doesn't look good, but yeah, you get the idea that this is how you can change. You can put in a username caption, and you can put in the login button, the buttons for login and logout. You can also change the front page color. I don't know how will it look like. It doesn't look good, but yeah, this is where you can actually customize your captive portal with your company logo and other details, whatever you want to configure. So that brings us to the end of this lab. Let's continue with the presentation. Clientless user. So what is a clientless user? A clientless user does not require a user to authenticate with Cyberoam. So it's a static mapping of user with a fixed IP address. So why do you need a clientless user? It's very useful for servers to access internet like a Windows patch update server. It can't authenticate itself. Print servers, VoIP phones. So can these servers authenticate themselves? No, they can't do it by themselves. So that is why you need to create a clientless user for any specific servers like this, wherein they don't have to authenticate themselves, but they can be treated like a normal user. Even in our lab infrastructure, you will see that I've created a clientless user for my Active Directory server. So when you do the labs, I'll show it to you that we also got the same clientless user for Active Directory server, as we did not want Active Directory server to authenticate every time. So it's mainly used so that the server doesn't have to authenticate, but you can still treat it like a normal user and apply security policies on these users. So this is how you add a clientless user onto Cyberoam. So to add a clientless user, you need to navigate to Identity, Users, Clientless User, and click on the Add button. You put in a username, put in the static IP address, put it in a group, in the clientless open group, and you put in an email address, and you define the spam digest setting. So to check if the user is listed, go to Identity, Users, and Clientless User, and then click on the username, and you can see that these are the security policies which you can apply on a clientless user. However, there are a few less policies which you can apply on a normal user, but still there are certain policies which you can still apply on a clientless user. Let's have a look at single sign-on feature from Cyberoam. So Cyberoam can be integrated with Active Directory or Novel e-Directory to provide single sign-on for transparent user authentication. So with SSO, users only need to sign in once to access network. So you don't have to get through the login page or not be getting the login page. You don't need to install any corporate client to authenticate yourself. Domain credentials can be used to authenticate a user for any traffic type without providing username or password to the Cyberoam. So what's the benefits? Ease of use, transparency to users, and improves the user experience because the users come in, they log into the domain, and they are transparently authenticated by Cyberoam, and security policies are applied on those users. So the user don't get a login page, they don't need to install anything on their computers or desktops or laptops, but they're still transparently authenticated by Cyberoam, and security policies are applied on them. So Cyberoam provides SSO through Sitas, which is the Cyberoam Transparent Authentication Suite. It's mainly for Active Directory and Novel e-Directory. As of now, these two platforms are supported. It also does it via NTLM, which is for Active Directory only. It has also got a Cat-C client, which is called Cyberoam Authentication for Terminal Clients. And the terminal servers which are supported are Microsoft and Citrix terminal services. And apart from that, Cyberoam also provides VPN single sign-on for remote users. So even if the users are not a part of the domain, have never logged into the domain ever locally, they can still authenticate with their domain credentials when they are accessing through VPN. And Cyberoam can also be integrated with Radius for remote authentication dial-in user service. This is for external Radius server. Let's have a look in detail for the Sitas. Now, Cyberoam Transparent Authentication Suite, Sitas, is a software component which needs to be installed on Active Directory server for SSO. So it eliminates the need of installation of SSO clients on each workstation and delivers a high level of protection. Now you need to install a small software onto your Active Directory server, which you can download it from our website, but you don't need to install anything else on any other end computers. So that's the only piece of software which you need to install on the Active Directory server. As of now, Sitas works on IPv4. Now this is the login flow. So how we do that? Now the Sitas software is sitting on the Active Directory. So on a successful login of a user to the Active Directory server, it generates an event ID of 672 for Windows 2003 and 4768 for Windows 2008 and 2012. Now the moment the ID is generated, the agent sitting on the Active Directory server picks up this login event ID for the respective server version and this passes it on to the Cyberoam. So Sitas sends audit log information to Cyberoam on port number 6060. So that's how the Cyberoam knows, okay, this user has logged in from this IP address at this time, and Cyberoam puts that particular user in the live user list. Now there can be different deployment scenarios. One of the best example would be a primary domain controller and a backup domain controller. Now in the next slide when we'll be talking about Sitas components, we'll see that in the Sitas suite there is an agent and there is a collector as well. Now the job of an agent is to pick up the event ID on successful login and put it to the collector and send it to the collector. And the collector sends it to the Cyberoam that this user is logged in from this particular IP address at this time. So let's see how it happens. So the agent, once you get the login information, once the agent picks it up, it passes it on to the collector, and then the collector sends it to the Cyberoam and says, okay, I have logged it on, and this is the particular user that I've logged on, and Cyberoam puts that particular user on the live user list. So then another user comes in and logs into the backup domain controller. Now in the backup domain controller, you don't need to install the entire suite. It all happens. All the agents need to communicate with the collector, and this agent again sends an information to the collector saying that this is the user who was logged in from this IP address at this time, and collector again informs Cyberoam on port number 6060 that this user has logged on from this IP address at this time. So wherever the agent is, it can be a lot of remote branches where you've got a lot of backup domain controllers. You need to install only the agent in the Sitas, not the entire suite. But however, on the main or Active Directory main AD controller, you need to install the Sitas suite so that you've got the collector. In other scenarios, you can also have the collector installed on another desktop machine as well. And you can configure it on a different machine. In that case as well, the agent will inform the collector and the collector will inform the Cyberoam. Here also the agent will inform the collector and the collector informs Cyberoam that this user has logged in. So collector is a kind of relay agent which conveys information to the Cyberoam, and all the agents report to collector this user has logged in from this particular IP address at this time. Now how is the login flow for a non-domain computer? Let's have a look at that. Let's say you have some of the user has logged in from a Macintosh computer. So it's logged in directly to the Cyberoam because it can't log into the domain. In that case, Cyberoam queries the collector on port number 6677, and the collector sends a WMI, a ping, or a remote registry to the end user computer. And if the result is successful, informs the Cyberoam that okay, this authentication is successful, please log him into the live users list, and Cyberoam puts that particular user in the live user list. Now this is the Sitas component slide. So Sitas composes of two components. One is the agent, the other one is the collector. So what is the job of the agent? It traps the user authentication events using Microsoft event logs and sends such events to the collector. And this component is needed in case of event logs login method. So if you are using the event log as your login method, then you need the agent component. Whereas the job of a collector is to process events received from agents and store in its database for tracking. And it also authenticates the user in Cyberoam. So that's the job of a collector. So when you install Sitas software, you get this three options wherein you get this SSO suite, you get the CTO collector and the CTA agent. If you are planning to install it on the main Active Directory, you can go with the SSO suite. And if you are installing it on a backup Active Directory on a remote side, you can go with the CTA agent installation only. Now this is some of the Sitas configuration. Once you install the suite software, you get this particular settings. The CTA agent, here we have selected it as event log so that it traps the events and send it to the collector. Now specify the networks to be monitored. Here you have to put in the entire subnet from where your users are going to log in. Now be very careful if you're having multiple VLANs. You have to add all those individual networks over here, or else those networks will not be able to authenticate themselves. Now this is the collector setting. You have to put in your Cyberoam appliance IP address, and this is the workstation polling method, which is via WMI or via registry read. And the log of detection settings can be via workstation polling or via ping. So here it's set to workstation polling and the workstation method is set to WMI. Now we'll be explaining the log of detection in the later slide. So when you try to detect a log of, the Sitas suite over here fires a WMI query to the end computer if you have selected WMI over here. And there are some detection intervals and the port numbers which Cyberoam and CTA agent listen to. Now, Event Log and Net API are Microsoft's utilities that help in detecting accurate, successful domain user login. However, there is no built-in utility that detects user log of detection, and hence Cyberoam provides two different methods for log of detection. If you enable log of detection, Cyberoam Collector by default checks user log off at every 10 minutes of interval. So let's see how the log of detection happens. So let's say you've got three users now. User Ricky, who is logged on from 10.120.16.45. User Robert logged on from this IP address, and user Michael logged on from this IP address. As you can see in the live users, you've got three users, Ricky, Robert, and Michael. So let's see what Sitas does. Now the collector will do a logout method depending on whether you have selected ping, workstation polling via WMI or remote registry, and the logout interval is 6 or 5 seconds by default, which is around 10 minutes. After 15 minutes, let's say user Ricky disconnected himself from the domain, he just went back home. So what the collector is gonna do is, collector is gonna pull logout after 15 minutes, and it does the same thing to all the users, and this time it finds, oh okay, Ricky is not there, I didn't get a successful response for my WMI query, so he's logged off, and inform Cyberoam, please log off Ricky from your database, and you can see in the live users there is no Ricky anymore, and that's how the log off detection works in Sitas. Now these are the settings which I showed you in the earlier slide. So workstation polling method, it can be WMI or registry read, and the detection of workstation polling or ping. Now Sitas fault tolerance. You might be thinking, okay, I've got collector, all the agents report to collector. What if the collector goes down? And that's why collector, being an essential component in transparent authentication mechanism, it is required that collector failover be configured, which is also known as Sitas fault tolerance. So Cyberoam allows building up group of backup collectors for fault tolerance. One of these collectors will act as primary while remaining are backup collectors. And Cyberoam allows adding up to 5 collectors in a single group. And that's why, because of a critical component, because collector being a critical component, we have created Sitas fault tolerance. From Sitas, you can also have some advanced settings, like you can check the online users, who are the users who are currently online. You can see the log file by clicking on view log. You can increase the log file size, anything in between 10 to 25 meg. You can also perform some troubleshooting tools, like you can do WMI verification for a specific IP address, and in case you get a failed response, which means probably there could be a Windows firewall or any other software firewall which is blocking it, so you know, oh okay, my log of detection is not gonna work properly. And then you've got some other connectivity tools to test connectivity with Cyberoam, Sitas agent, and Sitas collector as well. Now this is the Sitas live users page in the software itself, and you can see all the users who are currently logged in, from which domain and from which IP address. You can see the login time and the logon type as well. Now logon type value 1 stands for workstation polling. So if you get a value 1 over here, you mean, oh okay, this is a workstation polling request. And the logon type value 2 stands for authentication from AD, which means they're authenticating against Active Directory. Now the second method of single sign-on is NTLM. So it's a browser-initiated single sign-on authentication. And it is a challenge response authentication protocol to authenticate the user while accessing internet or an application. So what are the prerequisites for that? Cyberoam must be integrated with an Active Directory prior to configuring NTLM. And in order to run NTLM, following requirements must be met. The server has to be Windows 2003 or 2008 or even 2012. The protocol can be NTLM version 1 or version 2. The browsers supported are Google Chrome, Firefox, and Internet Explorer. As of now, NTLM works on IPv4. Now there are two methodologies for NTLM. The first one is the agent-based, wherein it's a software-dependent agent-based solution, and the software needs to be installed on domain controller. And the second method is agentless, which is a hassle-free software-independent solution, and no software component is needed. Now, Cyberoam NTLM implementation is based on agentless. Now this is how the NTLM process flow happens. So when you try to browse, the client sends a GET request to the server sends 401 unauthorized and asks you to authenticate via NTLM. Now this time the server sends a GET with the authorization type 1 message, and the server sends again unauthorized and authenticate yourself with type 2 message. And the client sends, okay, GET with the authorization of NTLM with type 3, and server says, alright, you're authenticated and now you can access my resources. So that's an entire NTLM process flow which happens in NTLM. Now how do you enable NTLM? Cyberoam must be integrated with Active Directory to enable NTLM, and then it's fairly easy on the configuration part in Cyberoam. You need to go to System, you need to go to Administration and Appliance Access. Under Authentication Services, you can enable access of NTLM for the required zone. So if you need NTLM from LAN, DMZ, or any other custom zone, you just need to tick in NTLM in the Appliance Access. Now, there is an authentication failover approach provided by Cyberoam. So let's have a look at the authentication precedence over that. The first priority goes to clientless users because they don't have to authenticate and automatically they're online. The second preference or precedence goes to clientless single sign-on users. If the clientless single sign-on authentication fails, it falls back to corporate client if you have corporate client installed in your laptop or desktop. Then it goes to NTLM, and finally if every of the authentication mechanisms fail, it finally throws you a captive portal and asks you to authenticate yourself. Now CAPC, which is a thin client authentication. So what is a thin client? A server that provides ability to host multiple simultaneous client sessions is termed as a terminal server. Such server is capable of hosting multi-user desktops. The user uses remote access software, allowing client computer to serve as a terminal emulator. Users shall connect to terminal server and access the resource or internet from the virtual user desktop. A very good example would be Microsoft Terminal Server or Citrix Terminal Server. What is the challenge? Firewall will see only terminal server IP address as a source whenever thin client user try to access internet, and it's very difficult to differentiate the user traffic. And there is a small gotcha which I didn't cover yet. CATC works on IPv4 only as of now. So let's have a look at the challenge of thin client authentication. So all these users are having these IP addresses and they log into the terminal server and go online through Cyberoam to the internet. But what the Cyberoam sees is the IP address of the terminal server because all these users are logging into the terminal server. So you can see the request goes to the terminal server and then you request for google.com. Now you cannot define rules based on a combination of IP address and destination IP. That can't be done. So the challenge here is the firewall sees the IP address of the terminal server. However, it doesn't understand there are so many sessions which are logged in at the same time. So it cannot differentiate and cannot apply policies to different users. So what Cyberoam does is the users are differentiated by session ID. Whenever a session starts in, Cyberoam stamps that particular session with the session ID over here, and that's how it differentiates between various users like Victor, George, Mary. So all the sessions you can see are stamped with the session ID. Now it's supported on Windows 2003, 2008, 2012, Citrix Presentation Server, and Citrix XenApp. In order to run CAT-C, following requirements must be met. UDP port 6060 must be open on terminal server for outbound to serve login information to Cyberoam. Native firewall, antivirus, or user account control might intervene Sitas processes and are subject to be disabled or removed in some cases. Now this is how the CAT-C agent looks like. You can also download the software from our website, and you need to install this software on your terminal server. So you need to start it, you need to put in the Cyberoam IP address, and you need to update it. If you want to have any user or any service excluded from it, you can put it in the exclusion list as well. Let's have a look at the process flow of login. So the user logs into the terminal server using remote access software. Now the user opens up a browser to access internet. The CAT-C will send UDP packet on port number 6060 to Cyberoam, which consists of login code, session ID, source port, destination IP, and username. And that's how Cyberoam identifies each user with the session ID. Now Cyberoam will check the packet sent by the agent and does a reverse lookup into its live users list. If the user doesn't exist, new user will be automatically added to the live user table in Cyberoam. And once the user is authenticated, the user traffic is allowed or denied based on the access control defined for that particular user. So how the logout happens? Terminal server as well maintains the database of the users currently connected to it. This database is dynamically updated when the user logs off. The agent installed on the terminal server shall refer to the database continuously and notify Cyberoam device instantly on the user log off. So the agent sitting on the terminal server looks for the terminal server database, and if there is any user which has logged off, and immediately the agent informs Cyberoam that, okay, log off this user because this user has logged off. So let's have a look at the VPN SSO feature of Cyberoam. So Cyberoam VPN provides remote worker secure access to corporate networks without the need for logging onto Cyberoam through captive portal at client. Now, initially it used to be required that if you are authenticating to a domain in your local network, the user has to first authenticate locally to the domain, and then he can use VPN for authentication from his home or any other remote place. But now administrator can provide authorized access to corporate applications behind the firewall from outside the corporate network by enabling single sign-on at the time of VPN authentication. So from now onwards, you don't have to locally authenticate to your domain in your office. Even if you have never logged into the domain earlier, doesn't matter. You can always connect via VPN client, and there will be a VPN SSO which will be performed by Cyberoam. So single sign-on can be configured for remote users using the following VPN clients. You can either use the SSL VPN, IPsec VPN, Cisco VPN, L2TP, or PPTP. Use either any of these VPN clients, and there will be VPN single sign-on performed by Cyberoam. Now the question is, how do you enable that? So to enable single sign-on feature for individual VPN type, you need to go to Identity, Authentication, and VPN. And here you can enable the VPN single sign-on. Apart from this, Cyberoam also offers you Radius single sign-on, wherein the Cyberoam will transparently authenticate the users authenticated on another Radius server. In most of the scenarios, in a lot of corporate places, you will see a different access points, and there will be a wireless controller which is authenticating from a Radius server. So what Cyberoam does is Cyberoam receives Radius accounting records from the Radius server, and you can apply group-based policies on those particular users. So whenever the user authenticate via our radio server with their access point, Cyberoam transparently authenticates them and apply group-based policies. So how do you configure that? You need to go to Identity, Authentication, Firewall, and you have to enable the Radius SSO. And here you can put in the Radius client IP, so whatever is the Radius client IP, put that IP address, put in the shared secret, and then you can apply, click on apply, and your configuration is done. Pretty simple to configure from Cyberoam point of view, and it gives you the benefit even though you have an existing wireless network in your office. Cyberoam can transparently authenticate all those wireless users and apply their respective group-based policies. Now let's have a look at the SMS or text-based authentication for guest users. Now, it is very tedious for an administrator to create users and provide credentials to users in public places like hotspot or hotels for a few days or hours. This method provides a portal to guest users using which they can self-create internet access tokens through Cyberoam appliances via password received on their SMS-enabled communication device. Cyberoam facilitates to be integrated with SMS Gateway, so it becomes very easy for the administrator. You don't have to create multiple users with different internet access policies. The user themselves can create their own usernames and they can receive their username and password as an SMS. So all you need to do is first integrate Cyberoam with an SMS gateway. You need to give it a name and put in the URL of your SMS gateway. You can use any of the HTTP method. You can use a cell number format. These are the request parameter and response parameter and format given to you by your SMS gateway provider. So you need to fill this up as well. And you can use the test connection button to test it. And then you go to enable guest users and then you select the SMS gateway which you created. Then you can either use the cell number as the username, or else you can also use an auto-generate username which will be generating username automatically, and that's done by Cyberoam. You can also have a username prefix and set a user validity as well. The best example would be auto purge on expiry, which is very much required for most of the administrators because guest users come in and go off and probably they might never turn up. So why keep that particular user on Cyberoam? So select auto purge on expiry. After the validity period, the user is automatically deleted. You can have the captcha verification as well. And now when the user logs in, he gets a login page. All he needs to do is he needs to click on this particular link. Click here to get a username to access the internet. And you put in your name, email, the cell number, and the captcha verification, and you get the username and password SMS to you. And you put in the username and password over here, and you're authenticated and you can access internet access. So now we'll learn about the identity-based policies. So the first policy which we'll learn about is the access time policy. It defines the time period during which users can be allowed or denied the network access. For example, only office hours access. So it enables you to set a specific time interval, days and time for network access with the help of a schedule. So you can go to identity, you can go to policy, and then you can go to access time and create the access time policy, and you can say, oh, okay, I'll probably allow it during all the time or probably during the weekend, and you can apply it to an individual user and to an individual group as well. So you can say during this specified time frame, the user will be allowed to access internet. Alternately, you can do with deny as well, saying that okay, deny access during weekends. If you apply that policy on a user, the user will be allowed internet access all throughout the weekdays, but apart from he will be able to access that in weekends. The next policy is the surfing quota policy. It defines the duration of network surfing time. So it's the allowed time in hours for a group or an individual user to access internet. You can go to identity, policy, and surfing quota. And here you can create a policy and you can see there are two types. One is cyclic, one is non-cyclic. So cyclic is the same policy you can reuse multiple times, whereas a non-cyclic is a one-time policy. And you say, okay, if you apply this policy to a user and the user will be allowed to browse the cycle hours 10, and the validity is unlimited and the maximum is unlimited. So at this point of time, this policy means the user can browse internet access or have internet access for 10 hours per day, and it goes on recurring since this is cyclic. However, if you set a validity not unlimited and you set it to 10 days, the user will be able to browse for 10 hours every day, and that's for 10 days. Now there's also a set of maximum hours which you can clarify, and you can say, okay, I'll give it probably 100 hours. So if you mix and match, what does it exactly mean? So you can browse 10 hours per day, total of 10 days, or 100 hours, whichever is earlier. So depending on that, you can set various criteria and apply it to different users and different user groups as well. The next policy is the data transfer policy. So you use this policy to restrict the users to upload and download. So data transfer restriction can be based on total data transfer, which is upload plus download. It's a total data transfer, or else you can also go with an individual upload and or individual download as well. So if you want to create a data transfer policy, you need to go to identity, policy, and data transfer. And this is how it looks like. So I've taken a sample screenshot. As you can see, you can do it on total data transfer or on individual data transfer. For the sake of an example, in the screenshot, we have done it with individual data transfer. Here also you get two options, cyclic, non-cyclic, and the cycle period is for a week. So which means you can have a download or upload data transfer of 10 meg and a download of 10 meg per week. And the upload and maximum upload download is maximum. So depending on what exactly you'd like to achieve, this is what your ISP does to you. This is what kind of policies they apply onto your home and office connection. You can say for a month you can have upload data of probably 1 gig and download of 10 gig, and you can say that policy is valid for, let's say, unlimited time if you want to do that, or else probably you can set like 100 gig is the max. So you can even do that as well. So depending on your requirements, what exactly and how you need to set up the policies, depending on what user you're applying to, you need to configure this particular data transfer policy. Let's have a look at the group management. So what is a group? A group is a collection of users having common policies. And instead of attaching individual policies to the user, create a group of policies and apply and assign the appropriate. So of course you're having like 10 groups and you're having, let's say, 6,000 users or 5,000 users. Suddenly you can't go out on individual user and apply policies. It's always advisable or better to apply the policies on a group, because they almost have the same kind of users in a respective group. Let's say, for example, in a sales group, all the sales people will be there. So if you apply a common filtering policy on sales people, it should be all the same for all the sales people. So it doesn't make sense that you go ahead and apply it on individual user, rather apply it on the group. So a group can contain default as well as custom policies. Various policies that can be grouped are surfing quota, access time policy, web filtering policy, application filter policy, bandwidth policy, and data transfer policy. So there are two types of group. One is a normal and the other one is a clientless group. So what is a normal group? So normal group is a user of this group need to log on to Cyberoam using the captive portal or authentication client or single sign-on to access the network resources. However, if a user of a clientless group is not needed to log in to Cyberoam using any client to access the network. You remember the clientless users, they will fall into the clientless group. Rest all other users will fall into the normal group. So if you want to add or edit a user group details, you can go to identity, you can go to groups, and here you can see you can select the group type to be normal or clientless. You can apply all these policies over here. You can also have a login restriction if you want them to log in from specific IP addresses or specific nodes. You can probably select this option. You can also do a MAC binding as well if you enable it. So you can bind the particular group of user to a particular set of MAC addresses so that that group of users can't log in from any other computers. You can have L2TP and PPTP policies as well, and you can also have SSL VPN policy. If you want to manage the groups, you need to go to identity, and then you need to go to groups, and here you can click on any group. You can click on configure on the toolbar icon over here, and you can modify a particular group, modify a set of policies in a particular group as well. If you want to add client list groups, you need to go to identity, you need to go to groups and click on add, and here you can add the client list group, and you can only apply some of these policies, including SSL VPN is not applicable, spam digest, you can do that as well. You can apply a QoS policy, you can apply a application filter and a web filter as well. Now let's have a look at the user management. So users can be identified by an IP or MAC address or a username and assigned to a user group. So we can identify a user by either an IP address or a MAC address. However, if you want Cyberoam to identify a user based on a MAC address, you need to sign in with the general authentication client or the corporate client, which I showed it to you in the earlier slides. Now all the users in a group inherit the policies defined for that group. So by default, if you apply a particular web filtering policy or any other policy to a group, all the users in that group will have the same policy. However, if you go inside the group and assign a different policy on a particular user, that user policy is always going to override the group policy. So keep it in mind, a user policy always overrides a group policy. But otherwise, a group or all the users by default inherit the group policies. Now Cyberoam supports three types of user: normal user, clientless user, and single sign-on users. Now you want to create the users, you need to go to identity, you need to go to users, and you need to click on add, and you can add a username, you can give in a password, you can select the user type, whether it's a user or an administrator, you can attach a profile if the user is an administrator, you can put in the email address, you can apply all the security policies on the user as well. Now you might be thinking, do I really need to create all these users? Well, yeah, if you're using the Cyberoam local authentication, then certainly yes. But if you're using any kind of external authentication server like Active Directory, Radius, LDAP, you don't need to create any of the users. You just need to import the groups, and then on their first login, the users will be automatically created on the Cyberoam with their respective policies of their groups. So to create the clientless user, you need to go to identity, user, and clientless user. So you put in a username, you have to have a static IP address for the clientless user. You put into the clientless open group, or else if you have created any custom clientless group, you can even put it in that. Put in the email address, and you can apply the spam digest settings. Now Cyberoam will automatically create the single sign-on user on their first successful authentication. So such users cannot be created manually. So that's how the single sign-on users are automatically created on Cyberoam. Even if you're not doing single sign-on and you're logging in via web portal, or captive portal, or via general authentication client, but you are using Active Directory authentication or Radius authentication or LDAP authentication, till then the users are automatically added on their first successful login. So that brings us to the lab 15, which will be doing integration with Active Directory. Alright, so let's start with the labs. Lab 15, integration with Active Directory. So we've already configured Active Directory, and we've got some groups over there as well. So let me first go to my training infrastructure. Now I've got two groups, sales and marketing, in Active Directory. So all I'll be doing is integrating Cyberoam with Active Directory. So I'll go to identity, I'll go to authentication, and here first I have to add the authentication server. So I'll click on add, I'll give the name as AD, and here you've got different options for LDAP or Radius. However, we are doing it for Active Directory, so I'll leave it to that. So I'll put in the IP address of the Active Directory, and then my domain FQDN is cyberoam.local, so I'll put in the NetBIOS name as Cyberoam. I'll put in the username and password. And there are two types of integration as explained earlier, so we'll go with tight integration, or we can go with loose integration. So depending on what you want to like we would like to go for. Let's go with tight integration. So we will put in the FQDN, which is cyberoam.local. And here I have to put in the search query. So I'll click on add, and I will say DC equal to cyberoam, DC equal to local. Okay, so here I'll put in DC equal to cyberoam, DC equal to local, and I'll click on OK. So since I'm doing tight integration, I have typed in the display name attribute as well. And now the next thing what I'll have to do is I'll have to test the connection to check whether there is connectivity or not. Now just for your information, I have actually placed my Active Directory in DMZ segment, as you can see it over here, because in real world scenarios most of the servers will be at DMZ. So I've kept it like that itself. So now I'll click on OK. And now I've integrated successfully with Active Directory. The next part is how does Cyberoam understand which user is going to log in and which groups they are going to fall. For that, what I have to do is I'll have to go ahead and click on import. Now this is the import groups wizard. We're not going to import any users. The users will be automatically logged in, as you saw in the presentation. Now there might be thousands of users, however there might be 20 or 30 odd groups. So all we'll be doing is importing the groups, and the user will be automatically logged in on their first login. So I'll start the import wizard. So here I have to put in the base DN. Instead of typing it, it will be automatically popping up here. So I'll click on search queries and it automatically pops up. So I don't have to type it. So I'll click on next. And here you can see that the entire container is users is imported, and now I have custom groups called marketing and sales. So I'll just import marketing. And I don't want to import sales as of now, and it's showing disabled. Probably I might have deleted that, but as of now I'll just go ahead with marketing. So I'll click on next. And here I don't want to attach these default policies to all of these groups. You can do that if you want, but it's better if we go ahead and individually apply different set of policies for different groups. Now certainly marketing team and technical team is going to have different policies, so better do not attach it to all the groups over here. I'll leave that, and we'll do that in the later labs. Here if you want, you can do it individually, but yeah, we have got some demonstrations in web filtering and other labs wherein we'll be demonstrating on applying it on individual groups. So I'll click on next, and you can see I'm going to import the marketing group here. So do you want to migrate the groups? Yes, I'd like to continue, and I'll close it. So let me now go to group section and see I've got marketing here as well. So now I've got two groups, sales and marketing. Sales I already imported it earlier, so hence I couldn't import sales. And marketing I've imported it now. Now the next thing is I don't have to import any user, but what I have to do is I have to go to authentication, and I have to go to firewall, and here the authentication server says it's still local. So I'll have to select 80 and I can bring it to the top. So now the primary authentication server is Active Directory, and whenever any domain user tries to log in, that authentication will be forwarded to the Active Directory server. So I'll click on apply. So now let me see whether I can browse or not. So I've got the login page. Now let me authenticate with the user John. And yes, I've logged in and I can browse. Yes, I can. Now let me see if I go to the live users. I see John at cyberoam.com is logged in via web client from this IP address with an IP family of IPv4. Now let's have a look at the user section. So you can see John is a member of sales group of Active Directory. So since we did tight integration, automatically the user is mapped with this group from Active Directory. You don't have to do it anyone. Now if you want to go ahead and log another user from marketing, they might log in. The user to group mapping will be automatically done by Cyberoam based on Active Directory, since we have used tight integration. I've got another user, Mary, who is a part of marketing group. So let me just try and authenticate with Mary and see what happens. So I'll log out from John and I will authenticate with Mary. Alright, so I've successfully logged in. Now let me just refresh this particular page and see Mary at cyberoam.com. Cyberoam.local is logged in here, and the group is marketing. So this is because of the tight integration. Now if I go to the live users, I won't be seeing John anymore because I already logged off from John. However, here if you go to authentication and Active Directory, and if you have selected loose integration here, then all of the users would by default fall to the open group, which is default in Cyberoam. So if you want to have a strict user to group mapping from Active Directory, you need to go with tight integration. So that brings us to the end of this lab. Let's continue with the presentation. So how do you manage the users? So in order to manage the users, you need to navigate to identity, and then you need to go to users, and here you can click on the any one user. If you want to modify any policy on that particular user, you can do that from here. You can add, you can import a list of users, you can change the status of any user. You can also purge the Active Directory users from here if you want to purge it on the Cyberoam database, which have already been imported and added onto Cyberoam. You can purge the 80 users from here as well. Now how do you manage the clientless user? So in order to manage the clientless user, you need to go to identity, you need to go to user, and then you need to go to clientless users to view a list of users and click username to be modified. So you come down to the clientless user page and click on the username on the clientless user, and you can modify the properties of clientless user. User MAC address binding, as we were talking about in the earlier slides, that in order for the Cyberoam to receive the MAC address, you need to use Cyberoam General Authentication Client, and you can actually bind a particular user to a particular list of MAC addresses or to a specific MAC addresses, so the user cannot log in from any other computers or devices which doesn't have that MAC address. So you need to navigate to identity, users, and go to user. Now this is not applicable to clientless user. This is only applicable for normal user. And also you have to keep one thing in mind. You have to use the general authentication client so that Cyberoam receives the MAC address of the end user. Now users are also given their own account to check their account status. So there is a feature called My Account, and the user My Account gives details like quarantine, change password, email, and internet usage for a particular user. A user can change his or her password using this tab. User can also view their My Account details from GUI as well. So they can go to Cyberoam and they can select My Account, they can log in with the username and password, and they can change their password if they want. They can check their account status, they can see how much amount of data they have used, so the usage, the current session, and the total. If they have been assigned a quota of data, they can also see the remaining amount of data which is assigned to them. Let's have a look at the identity-based firewall rule. In the rule matching criteria, a normal UTM does everything from matching source and destination addresses to port numbers. But next generation UTM like Cyberoam adds identity to the firewalling solution. So when Cyberoam receives the request, it checks for the source address, destination address, and the services and tries to match with the firewall rule. If identity or user is found in the live user connections and all other matching criteria fulfills, then action is specified in the rule and will be applied. Now you can see a normal firewall rule matching criteria is dependent on source address, destination address, service, schedule, and based on that you decide the action whether to accept the traffic, NAT the traffic, drop, or reject the traffic. What if you are in a DHCP environment or you're having Wi-Fi in your network? The source address is always going to change. So how will your rule matching criteria work in that environment? And that is the reason Cyberoam identity-based UTM puts in identity for rule matching criteria. And this is the specialty, and this is the patent pending technology of Cyberoam, wherein you stamp the identity or you impregnate the identity into the rule matching criteria itself, and you apply all the unified threat control policies depending on per rule matching criteria. You can apply the IPS policy, web filtering and application filter policy, QoS policy, antivirus and anti-spam, and routing decisions as well. Now, on IPv6, Cyberoam supports QoS and routing decisions. So if you take a snapshot of the rule base, you can see there is a attached identity field over here, and you can apply all the security policies depending on the user. So the user identity is attached into the rule matching criteria, and you can apply all the security policies. You can also do the load balancing. So everything is done and controlled via central firewall rule, and which matches the rule matching criteria as identity. You can also create an identity-based IPv6 rule as well. So you can put in an attached identity in the IPv6 rule, and you can select the appropriate source and destination. And you can also have QoS and routing policies on an IPv6 rule. So that brings us to the end of this module, and the next module we'll be doing is web filtering. So thank you for attending the presentation.